All right, episode 32, interview with Professor Scott Johnson, an expert in ancient civilizations, a professor, archaeologist, and we're going to talk to him about the Mayan civilization. That's his area of focus, of expertise. It's Professor Scott Johnson. Please enjoy the interview. Scott, who are you and what do you do?
Well, my name is Scott Johnson, and right now I run the Low Technology Institute in Cooksville, Wisconsin, which is a little village founded in the 1850s.
Oh, wow.
But before that, I was a college professor and Maya archaeologist and just archaeologist in general.
Okay. Um, I'm jealous. That's the job. That's a job I would just die for to have. Um, and so, anyways, yeah. You asked me about. I'm in Ohio and Kentucky, and we started out doing a feature-length documentary on how and why the United States is failing using the ground zero of the Midwest, the industrial
Okay, sure.
Rust Belt. So.
Yeah.
It started out as a feature and then it just evolved. These interviews were so good that I didn't edit them down to 15 little sound bites,
Sure.
So we made it a web series. We won 2 best of festivals so far.
Wow.
Yeah, I believe we'll pick up another trophy tonight. So having fun.
Yeah,
So
great.
I'm usually I usually do fiction. So
Okay,
big sci-fi movies and crap like that. But
sure.
this is my first foray into talking to smart people.
Oh, okay. So I'm kind of doing the opposite right now. So the book that you probably contacted me because of was Why Did Ancient Civilizations Fail? That was an academic book, right? It looks at 5 different ancient cultures and why one of the reasons I think they failed or collapsed, really. It's in the collapse genre. But my last chapter then kind of turned that same uh, lens onto ourselves and our society today. And I had some not great news for us. And my editor said, yeah, this last chapter is twice as long as it needs to
Scott,
be.
don't
Yeah.
bury the lead here. Don't bury.
Okay. Okay.
We're getting
Well,
there.
well, basically, what I'm saying is that I took half of that last chapter and I'm turning it into a novel, basically. So I'm on my first foray into fiction writing
Wow.
after a couple of books in academia. So it's all researched, but it's, follows a band of I guess what the government would call eco-terrorists who are bringing down the industrial society, and the stuff out of that chapter becomes kind of their manifesto.
Ah, okay. Interesting. How far along are you?
Oh, it's done. I'm because it's fiction. I have to find an agent. All of my nonfiction books, you can just approach the presses directly, but
Hmm.
that's how fiction works, unfortunately.
Uh, I know that even for screenplays, getting a literary agent is tough. Um,
Yep.
Very tough. But
Yep.
good luck, kid. If you want to make it into a movie someday, call me. You've got my number.
All right. Perfect.
All right, let's talk about your book.
Sure.
And the book is entitled Why Did Ancient Civilizations Fail? And you say you're in the collapse genre,
Sure.
but
Yep.
you don't use the word collapse.
Well, yes.
You
I
don't.
talk about it at some length in the book because collapse becomes kind of an empty term. Like I work right now in sustainability, but what does that really mean, right? So the problem with the just using the term collapse is, well, what collapses, right? So I'm a
Mhm.
Maya archaeologist. The Maya collapse meant that the elites and their way of life ended or changed drastically.
Mhm.
That doesn't necessarily mean that, John Q. corn farmer in the field, his life probably didn't change very much. So collapse for whom or collapse of what systems is important to specify. You can't just say, oh, it collapsed, right? Like there's a collapse after the Roman Empire, but then we had the proliferation of small castles and feudalism. So it's more of a transition than a collapse, and it's just that most people assign a value, and collapse has a negative value, whereas transition is a little more neutral. So it's a slightly better term to use, unless you want to define exactly what's collapsing: an elite collapse, an economic collapse, a socioeconomic collapse, things like that.
Okay. And define a civilization, because
Yeah. So this is an example of where an editor has sway over your book title, because civilization is one of those naughty words that we don't use in anthropology anymore, because civilization is freighted with a lot of colonial baggage, right? The original division was from savagery to barbarism to civilization in a unidirectional trend upward, right? And so the civilized people were on top of the heap, and the barbarians and the savages were below that. And obviously nobody talks like that anymore, because that is a simplistic and frankly just wrong view of how societies are ordered, right? We can learn a lot from hunter-gatherers. And so the term I use throughout the book is complex societies. And I talk about different scales of them. And the larger a society is, the more people it has interacting with one another, the larger the system is. Then you approach something that most people consider to be what's called a civilization. But yeah, that's the title has that, unfortunately. And I think most academics understand you don't have direct control over the title of your work. But yeah, what I really wanted to call it, though, is hubris. Why did ancient civilizations fail? But they said at that time I was 30. They said, you're 30, you can't write a book entitled Hubris, because you'd be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Oh man. Well, I love it. The hook that we started using, and again, it's just, I'm thinking movie cinematic device, was that all civilizations fail because they're made up of self-referential humans. And anything self-referential fails, whether it's math, philosophy, there's nothing succeeds when it's self-referential.
Snake eating its own tail.
Exactly. That's our hook. And so when I saw that you did hubris, I thought, shit, man, Scott, you stole my idea before I thought of it.
Yeah. So in the book, I kind of propose the idea of social hubris. And let me preface this by saying there's not one thing that causes the downfall of any civilization throughout history, right? There's many different things, and they all have to kind of work together. It takes a lot of different symbiotic systems to create a large-scale society and support a large-scale society. And the same thing happens when it collapses. It's not just one thing failing; it's many things failing altogether. So I warn against using what's called like the silver bullet idea of history. Like the Maya collapse was because of drought. The Romans failed because of barbarian invasions, right? Well, those things wouldn't have happened if other systems were robust, right? You don't have a collapse because of drought if you have a robust food system, right? So anyway, but the idea of social hubris is basically, real short example, use the Romans. The Romans were a small tribe. They start conquering and taking over their neighboring tribes, and they start adopting ideas, right? Like from the Etruscans, they get writing, and from others, they get all these different ideas. And over time, they build up this large empire, and they adopt all the best ideas, and they create a large functioning system. And when they're young and expanding, they're very dynamic and adaptive. But once they get kind of at the top level, right, their ideas crystallize. This is how we farm. This is how we conduct foreign relations. This is how we take care of our environment, or we don't. This is how we interact with these different things. And as the world around them changes, in terms of people around them, or the environment, or their resources, if they don't see that and allow their system to adapt, it collapses because it no longer is functioning in the existing world, right? You can have a system of agriculture in Mesopotamia that relies on agriculture that's through flooded fields, but when those fields become salted because of that system, if you don't change your ways, but you just do more of that, you're going to fail, right? So the idea is that they've become so big that they have hubris. They think, this is the way we've done it for 500 years. We don't need to change. The world needs to change to suit us. And obviously, we in our society certainly don't have any form of hubris about how we live at all. And I'm saying that facetiously, of course.
Yeah. I I was thinking about this interview last night. I'm talking to somebody from the Midwest, and uh, you're not supposed to say people are Nazis or fascists or anything like that. It's politically correct. But the guy was a fucking Nazi. It was just we did
Like self,
interview. We did a card carrying member of the Nazi Party. We did an interview with him. So,
really.
oh yeah, that was. We actually, I consider myself a flaming liberal, but he and I had something in common, um, and that is, I don't want to live in a country that he has the right to vote and lives in, and he doesn't want to live in one where I do. And so
Mm-hmm.
we were we just talked about how it'd be great if we could all go our separate ways and never see each other again.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, but then eventually, we live in a finite world, and eventually, resources become finite, and then you start to battle over resources, and then you're not living
Mhm.
independently, right?
Right.
There's no Earth 2.0, unfortunately.
No,
Uh,
I would guarantee you that him and his would get a little frisky after a while. And,
yeah, yeah, it's um, and at times of upheaval and turmoil, extreme ideas can become very, very attractive, right? Um, Theodore Kaczynski, known as the Unabomber, but he also, if you've actually read his stuff, he's not crazy by any means. He has some strong views, and obviously, I don't support violence in support of those views, obviously, but his views themselves are worth examining. And one thing he says about revolution is that it's attractive because um, it's much better than just changing the existing system. Small tweaks to the existing system, you still have the existing system that gives you the problem. Whereas a revolution or a major change that can supposedly alleviate many problems all at once. And so
Mhm.
it can be an attractive thing. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of ideas and opinions out there, and I'm somewhat libertarian in the idea of, I don't want to affect you and change what you're doing. But then when you're doing something that affects and changes the world around us such that it affects me, then we have to draw some line somewhere.
Mhm. We've interviewed a lot of economists, and they say, okay, revolution. That if we're immersed in an oligarchy, for example, um,
Mm-hmm.
there's very few ways to get out of it, and that revolution is pretty much the way people have changed and got out of the
Yeah.
oligarchy. And
Yeah.
but then both the two that I remember the most both said, but sometimes you get a shithole when after your revolution. It's not nirvana sometimes.
Right. Yeah.
So
Look at Egypt.
they had a revolution.
Well, they had the Arab
Oh, the Arab
Spring,
Spring.
and
Oh, I
they
thought you
and they
meant
kicked out, yeah, and they've just been transitioning through, yeah,
Syria.
yeah, it is much more of a roll of the dice, right? A
Mhm.
revolution is much more of a roll of the dice rather than a just incremental changes. You're probably not going to rock the boat as much. Yeah, I don't know what the policy prescription is. My major quibble with most economists is that they don't operate in a finite world model, or maybe they do now, but everything I've ever read seems like they think that GDP and other things, growth can go um, expansion, forever upwards, which is not possible because we have finite resources on this planet.
Mhm.
Eventually, we're going to hit a wall. And sometimes technology allows us to better use the resources we have, but there's still a finite amount of solar energy hitting this planet. Like there's just a finite amount, period.
Mhm. All right. Well, let's get your specialty are the Mayans, correct?
Yeah.
All right. That's very personal to me because when I was down there, I went to Chichen Itza, and I was floored, just
Mm-hmm.
absolutely floored. And you, when you were doing all that stuff, you got to walk amongst all that shit. Like, did you go to Easter Island? Have you?
No, I didn't. Unfortunately, that's too far for. grad students don't have enough money to fly to Easter Island unless they're getting paid, or unless they're, have research funds to do it, unfortunately.
Uh,
Um, Generally, but I actually did my dissertation about 15 minutes away from Chichen Itza.
oh,
So I spent years and years hacking through the it's not quite jungle there, it's a desert forest there, but yeah.
oh, beautiful. And it's just what it's like 2.5 hours outside of Cancun, or
Yep.
Playa del Rey or Playa
Yeah.
del Carmen. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Oh, so
And
it's really
buses run every
accessible.
day. And
We
there's a lot around there to see besides Chichen Itza. If you can, rent a car and drive around, you can see a lot of other sites that aren't quite so packed full of tourists. Although Chichen Itza is obviously worth seeing at least once. Yeah.
yeah, my wife, my second wife, Mexican, and we bought some land in Playa del Carmen, not far
Oh,
from Tulum.
sure.
And you know how many times I visited Tulum?
How many?
None. It
So
was
it's right there.
there.
Yep.
It was always like, I can do it tomorrow. But
Right. Exactly. Yep.
so,
That's how it works. Yeah. My second after I finished my dissertation, I ran a project on the north coast of Yucatan, right on the Gulf Coast, and we were looking at ancient salt production, which was really cool. But unfortunately, the academic job market is a tough one right now, and I've transitioned away from that. So,
why is that?
why is the job market difficult, or why did I transition away?
Job market difficult.
Um, well, so a little bit of inside baseball. A lot of universities have realized, hey, we should function more like businesses rather than institutions of higher learning. And instead of hiring one tenure track professor to teach maybe 3 courses every semester, so 6 courses a year, and pay them between $50,000 and $70,000 a year plus benefits, we can hire adjunct professors who work for between $2,000 and maybe $5,000 if you're lucky per class to teach those classes. And you don't have to give them benefits. You don't have to have them on every year. They're basically there when you need them and not when you don't. Uh, so it makes complete economic sense in a rational economic model to use just adjuncts, but that's not what universities should be about, in my opinion. And
Wouldn't it
so,
be just to
uh,
hire monkeys?
yeah, might as well. Not quite. No, I was an
I'm
adjunct
not
for years.
exaggerating for
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
But so basically, a lot of jobs would get 300 applicants when it was a tenure track position. They get 300 applicants
Hmm.
for anthropology and archaeology, which is insane. There aren't 300 jobs a year, and if there's 300 people applying, there's maybe 50, 60 jobs for archaeologists.
Hmm.
So it wasn't a healthy thing for me to do. It's not healthy for my friends to continue to do. A lot of them end up going to counseling for stress and depression and things like that because, if you get through graduate school and have a PhD, you usually feel like you should be able to succeed if you try and work hard enough.
Hmm.
And that's not necessarily the case in the academic job market right now. It's a complete it's up in the air. And then if you do get a job, it sucks, apparently. A lot of my friends who have tenure track jobs, they say, I can't complain about it because everybody's trying to get these jobs. And once I get the job, I can't complain about it or they'll be mad at me for complaining. So they have
Hmm.
no one to talk to about the difficulty that they have in their position. It's just um, the problem with higher ed right now is, in my opinion, a lot of colleges, and this is coming from teaching years and years of college, students are there to get a degree so they can get a good job.
Hmm.
Understandable, completely, makes sense in our economic world, but that's not why I'm there to teach them. I'm there to teach them to think critically, to express themselves clearly, right? And to introduce them to ideas, concepts that they wouldn't have otherwise been introduced to had they just gotten like an associate's degree in business. So those are two different reasons to be in the classroom. And I think there's something fundamentally broken there.
Couldn't you have taught them how to open up an archaeological store in a strip mall?
Yeah, right. Yeah, no. Yeah. Unfortunately, there's not too much. There's less private sector work for archaeologists. Less so for anthropologists. There's even less. But for archaeologists, there's a finite amount of things we can do outside of academia to directly use archaeology.
Couldn't you have done Indiana Jones shit and like start stealing artwork and shit? Wouldn't that work?
No, the FBI will catch you.
Oh,
They have a art forgery department that also works with artifacts and things like that. And my father was a police officer, and he always encouraged me to go to the FBI as a job. And after my PhD, I actually did look them up,
Mhm.
because that would be something that I could, do, having a background in antiquities and things like that. But decided it wasn't for me. I don't know. I didn't want to shave my beard to be a G-man.
There's a TV show out now, something about lost treasures, where a former FBI agent now is doing
Sure.
Indiana Jones shit.
Sure.
But anyways, we digress.
Yeah,
Maya,
yeah, yeah.
the Mayans. Tell us about the Mayans. Did they have a good
Uh,
afternoon or a bad couple centuries?
it was a bad couple centuries, and also it wasn't just the weather. Although, okay, so ancient Maya, for those that don't know, flourished between southern Mexico and Honduras, El Salvador area, Guatemala, Belize. And they had large scale civilization on par with Rome, although they weren't as territorially expansive or autocratic as Rome, right? They were a whole bunch of more like later Italy, where it was a whole bunch of kingdoms, maybe more like feudalism. Yeah,
I get you.
yeah, I'm just broad strokes, right?
Mhm.
They lived on corn, beans, and squash. They had big cities. They had a very complex social system, very complex religion. They had a full writing system, the only one in the Americas. Wonderful. Anyway, around 800, 900 of the Common Era, there start to be some droughts, and we can see this really clearly through speleothems, which are like the stalactites and the stalagmites in caves, record how much of different isotopes drip into them each year. You know how they get those slight
Mhm.
layers each year? And then you can date them and you can see, oh, there's actually droughts during certain periods and lots of rain during other periods, kind of like tree rings. Anyway, we see that there was drought between 8 and 900, and this really caused structural problems because they had built up these large cities with all these fields around them,
Mhm.
and those cities were fed by their surrounding fields, but the fields depended on rain for agriculture. They didn't really have much. They had some places with canals and water infrastructure, but for the most part, they were able to exist really well with just the existing rainfall. You take that rainfall away, it exacerbates other things, social problem, unrest. But taking away people's food is a big one for causing um, tension, aggression, right? We see this in psychological studies. If you're hungry, there's a reason that Snickers had that whole series of hangry advertisements, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so if you're missing your food base, you're kind of in trouble. Interestingly, the place that didn't see this problem was the north, where Chichen Itza is, because they already were living in a desert. So they had adapted their agricultural system to live in
Mhm.
an arid environment. And so when there was a drought, they were better off. And there wasn't so much of a pronounced collapse in the north as there was in the southern lowlands, where we think of like Tikal and these big, if you've seen Apocalypto, don't get me started on Apocalypto, but that's the southern lowlands, the jungles that you're thinking about. So this collapse that we see is of elite centers, right? We see the kings and queens and the royal courts and the large buildings and the writing and all this sort of stuff kind of falling by the wayside because it can't be supported without surplus food.
Mhm.
And what we see is the rise of mercantile kings. So basically traders who are still maintaining these long distance trade networks around Mesoamerica, all the way up through the Aztec area, all the way down to South America. They still exist, and they start to accumulate a lot of power. And so after the collapse, we just see different people in charge, and they're not in charge for theological reasons,
Mhm.
which the previous rulers were. They're in charge for more economic reasons, it seems to be, and it's more through economic coercion rather than religious coercion. So it's a collapse on one for the elites. If you were an elite, it was a complete collapse. But if you're a Maya farmer, growing corns, beans, and squash out in the jungle, you're not going to see too much difference, really.
Now the elites, they just went into retirement.
Hard to say. I mean, that's one of the difficulties that we have about this sort of deep time without written records that are like more exhaustive books. We basically have monuments, right? So it says this ruler built this city and defeated this other ruler and had this child, whatever. But it doesn't. There's no like monuments to them collapsing and fading off into obscurity to say, oh, he just became some poor farmer, right? You wouldn't raise a monument to that
Right.
person. So we don't know. If maybe some of them were killed by an angry mob. Maybe some of them just tried to get away. Maybe some ran to other elite places that hadn't collapsed yet and became, exiles in effect. So it's really hard to say.
I thought it was a real horrific end. I thought there's some records where they, cut their hearts out and had a.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, so the Aztecs were into, when we talk about sacrifice, the Aztecs were into actual heart sacrifice. The Maya were more into auto sacrifice, so you sacrifice your own blood.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's back up and say why they did the sacrifice, because I think a lot of times it's easy to say, well, that's crazy. But if you know the reason behind it, it's actually not. It makes a lot of logical sense, even though we probably aren't going to take it up ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about the Maya gods, they're up and they provide rainwater for the corn, for
Mm-hmm.
the people to live on, right? And what do the gods live on? The gods live on blood. And so to repay the gods for the rain, you have to give them blood, right? It was a cyclical relationship. And if we're not getting enough rain, maybe we need some more blood
Okay.
sacrifice, right? To give to the gods. So we're feeding the gods, they're feeding us. It's a circular sort of thing. So it's not, just killing people for killing people. So now the Maya, what they would generally do is use what are called blood letters. It's a stingray spine.
Oh,
Because why
wow.
would you go or flakes of obsidian, and they would cut their tongue, their ears, or in the case of rulers, often their penis,
Oh,
because yeah, and then they would bleed it out onto paper, and then they would burn the paper, and that paper would then bring the blood up to the gods. And it's really cool. There's some amazing imagery in the Yaxchilan lintels where there's like gods or ancestors coming out of the smoke and like talking to the people. It's really cool.
I think
But
some
if you think
peyote
about it,
involved there.
what's that?
Some peyote involved.
Um, they certainly used hallucinogenic substances, and there's some vases that show hallucinogenic scenes.
Mhm.
But as far as we know, the way that they generally ingested those was through enemas.
I'm loving these people more and more.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Bleeding
I
enemas and bleeding. Hey, there was we had a tour guide, and I don't know if he made this up,
uh-huh.
but it's along the lines of what you're talking about. There's that football, that stadium kind of thing, the
Yeah,
sports
yeah, the ball
area,
game. Uh-huh.
and the winner was sacrificed. Is that true?
So we have records of ball games where the loser was sacrificed, or no, the winner was sacrificed. Yeah, because you want the gods want the best meal, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And you also have to think about it in such a way that like these people weren't necessarily unwilling, right? In the Mesoamerican worldview, the only way that you got to the equivalent of heaven was
Mhm.
by dying in battle, being sacrificed, or dying in childbirth for women.
Mhm.
And
Okay.
so if you didn't go to heaven, or the equivalent of this, then you basically went to, it wasn't quite hell, it was more like purgatory. You basically lived in caves under mountains, and it was just cold and damp and wet all the time and pretty unpleasant. So
Cleveland.
dying as a sacrifice ensured that you were going to heaven,
Okay.
right? And if you're, we know religious people today or in the recent past that, believe, hey, I'm going to die and go to heaven.
Mhm.
It's not a sacrifice for me. It's a, benefit. So,
Yeah.
uh, and just to circle back to the, um, the bloodletting, if you think about it, where does a ruler's power come from? It comes from his tongue and
Mhm.
also his ability to beget heirs, right? So
Right.
where are they letting the blood from? They're letting the blood from their tongue and their penis. So
Oh,
this is like I'm sacrificing from the best, the most important parts of my body to give blood to the gods, and then the gods will then give rain to my people.
so he's not cutting off his dick.
No,
It-
no, 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 no. Just
oh,
like a, it'd be much more than a diabetic pricker, but
okay.
it would, but
Oh,
it
it
would not
that's a
cut off.
thing. This
Yeah,
this
just lancing, and then the blood comes out. Yeah.
okay.
Yep. Yeah,
Still. All right. So what other civilization? So drought was
right,
one of the chief, and the lack of systems, the lack of the ability to react to the drought.
right. Yep.
Now, go ahead.
I say that it's not the straw that breaks the camel's back that we should be looking at. It should be, the hay bale that's already on the camel's back,
Okay.
right? Not the final straw, but like that whole bale of straw that's already there, right?
Uh-huh.
There's a lot of things that make this a precarious situation. They had built these large cities. They were very dependent on intensive agriculture.
Hmm.
If something has a kerfuffle there, then the rest of your systems start to wobble, and if they're already somewhat unstable, they can collapse very easily.
Now, I read not so recently, but not that long ago, it's the creation of stucco.
Hmm.
Have you heard that theory?
Yeah, it's certainly a good indicator of their resource base
Hmm.
because just back up a short second. Stucco is basically limestone that's been heated by a lot of wood and burned down into lime, and then that's rehydrated, and then it creates a chemical reaction to recombine into limestone again. And
Hmm.
you can spread it on floors, and then that dries out, turns into limestone. You have a nice, smooth limestone floor, which is what stucco is, right? And
Hmm.
so we see in the early periods really thick stucco floors, multiple centimeters thick, real thick, because they can get a lot of limestone, and importantly, they can get a lot of trees. And it takes an incredible amount of fuel to slake the lime, to break down that limestone into lime. And as time goes on, their woods keep getting farther and farther back, and we can see this through
Oh.
erosion. We can see this through soot in the air. We can see it through pollen in the ponds and what sorts of trees were available at what times and what weren't. And then also, we can see it through the stucco, which gets thinner and thinner. Each layer that they put up is thinner and thinner as they have less resources to make more stucco.
Ah,
So I don't think that's the one. I don't think that would have completely been the nail in the coffin, but it's an example of a system that was taxed, right? They're overtaxing their woods
mhm.
to get all this fuel. Well, and then when they have problems with erosion, that's going to exacerbate your problems with agriculture.
Yeah. You guys are actually able to track this deforestation. Um, and
Yeah,
was
many
not,
lines of evidence.
pardon?
Many lines of evidence show that happening. Yep.
Okay. And that was maybe a straw
Yeah,
or a bale of
absolutely.
hay. Yeah.
Sure, sure, sure.
All right. What other civilizations did that about do it? The droughts, deforestation?
Droughts, deforestation. There's probably So warfare probably wasn't quite as big a deal as some people like to make it out to be. The Maya didn't have warfare of like armies on armies. They had professional or elite level soldiers. They didn't go for territory. They went for um, economic power or basically hegemony, like political power over an area rather than like making borders and defending them. So yeah, I mean those were large contributing factors to it. Yeah, for sure.
Now, Rome. Do we know why Rome failed?
So there's a couple of good books out there about it, and they all have a couple different takes on it. And basically, all the different things you hear about Rome collapsing, all the different causes, they probably all contributed.
Mhm.
Again, there's not one thing that caused the downfall of Rome. There were many combined factors, right? They had basically farmed out. We'll start with agriculture. They kind of farmed out the area around Rome and realized it's more economically advantageous to grow wine and olives, and so
Mhm.
they converted all these farmlands into vineyards. Well, then where are you going to get your grain from? Well, they had grain shipments coming from Africa. It's one of the few times in ancient history where people depended on food being brought in from so far away. And we see huge bread riots when those grain shipments failed. So that economic change to growing wine kind of hollowed out their own agricultural core and made them dependent on their colonies. Um, the government of Rome waxed and waned in effectiveness. But one of the big things that really helped prop them up economically was their ever expanding empire. And after a certain point, it got to be so large and expansive that they really couldn't maintain it
Mhm.
using ancient communication methods. You're too large, right?
It's
And
a long
so,
walk to Germany.
what's that?
It's a long walk to Germany.
It is a long walk to Germany. Yeah, and like pigeons or things like that. I mean, you just can't. Or messengers on horseback, right? And to be fair, they did a good job of it, right? They made all of the Roman roads and the postal system so that they could have this communication system, but it could only go so far.
Mhm.
Anyway, so lack of communication over this large area led them to kind of have to curtail their expansion. And once you curtail expansion, you don't have that income from booty from war
Mhm.
coming in anymore, which was a big bump for their coffers that they didn't have anymore. And so they tried taxes, and people don't like taxes. They also, just like their agricultural core got hollowed out, so did their production core. Like they started importing things rather than making them themselves.
Mhm.
So their economy became completely dependent on imports, which can become dangerous if your system starts to wobble. And people in the colonies say, "Why are we sending all this nice wine from France to or Gaul at that time to Rome? Why don't we keep it for ourselves? Or why don't we send it over somewhere else where they're paying more for it?" So it just became a large, unstable, unruly mess. And the hubris that I talk about for Rome is that, well, they say, well, we're Rome. Look at this empire we built. Uh, you know, uh, we were this big power, and now we should remain the same power by doing the same things we did, but it's not working anymore. And rather than change and adapt, they collapsed and fizzled.
I think Jared Diamond captures that in his book Collapse about those Vikings in
Yeah,
Greenland, uh, hubris, and just
yeah.
we're not.
Failure to adapt.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Which, again, not that that tells us to do anything about our current way of life, but yeah.
All right. Well, let's fast forward because I definitely. Well, let me tax your expertise real quick.
All right.
How about the printing press?
Uh-huh.
There was a lot of shit that went down after the printing press.
Yeah.
Um, would you consider that a collapse, a transition?
Um, I guess more a revolution, really. I mean, that's the word everyone uses for it, the printing revolution. And I think that's an apt one because making the more information we have available to us,
Mhm.
the more we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? If I want to build something, some sort of system for my house, I don't have to invent it from scratch. I can look up what other people have done, take all that, synthesize it, make my own or whatever.
Mhm.
That's useful for me. I I make fun of cell phones or smartphones all the time, but the truth is, like, I have access to every human
Mhm.
invention and thought practically that's been recorded on my phone. I mean, that's it's insane and wonderful, and we just use it to look at cat videos, but that's a different story. Um, so, just similarly, I think the printing press allowed for the proliferation of not just practical ideas, but we see a lot of economic ideas and socio-political ideas being spread by pamphlets, right? The U.S. was awash in pamphlets, and that's part of our, I guess, revolutionary history was all the pamphlets that went around. It's kind of like the blog posts or the Twitter of
Mhm.
of 300 years ago.
All right. Continuing on with that thought,
Hmm.
um, we just interviewed somebody, an expert in Nazi Germany,
Uh-huh.
and the use of the
Same
radio.
guy or the different guy?
Different guy. Oh,
Okay.
yeah, funny. Yeah. Well, I guess it was 90% fact and 10% fiction because he kind of got into the mind of Magda Goebbels, and
Yeah.
she was there from the beginning to the bunker. Um, but one of the things was the use or utilization of film and radios,
Yeah.
the mass production of radios,
Right.
and everybody had one, and he was in their living rooms. Um,
Right.
so that didn't turn out well. What I'm getting to, Scott, the long winding road I have you on here
Uh-huh.
is what about the Twitter and social media? Is that fucking us up?
So, huh. It, so technology, one technology or another isn't bad or good in and of itself, right? It's
Mhm.
how it affects society. So, just like the Luddites broke all the looms in England when when the Industrial Revolution happened, it wasn't because they were mad at looms and faster weaving. They were mad because they were losing their jobs,
Right.
right? So it's not the technology itself; it's what it does. And so Twitter, yeah, just like you said, with Goebbels, who could get into everyone with a radio's home. Thank God they didn't have television uh, or Twitter. But yeah, no, Twitter can get into everyone's. You can get bad ideas spreading probably faster than good ideas. It seems like, unfortunately. But the thing with Twitter, at least, is, and the same with radio, I guess, is you can turn it off. So you
Mhm.
have to have you have to have somebody who's willing to listen to it and willing to see what certain people are saying on Twitter. Um, I guess the news often covers it if it gets big enough, if something on Twitter if it gets big enough. But it could also be there's a lot of good that can be used for it. And I'm not just talking like sharing funny memes or things. I'm saying like emergency announcements and things like that. So there is some like utilitarian good things out of it. But yeah, it does seem to become an echo chamber and allow us to to silo ourselves and surround ourselves with people that think the same way as us. And I think that is one major difference with mass media, with radio and television, especially back in the day when there were only a few channels or a few radio stations. Everybody got the same facts, for good or bad, right? The Nazis obviously used that for bad, um, but then most governments use it for their own means anyway. So, good or bad.
Well, to bring it full circle,
Mm-hmm.
um, you were talking about the use of adjunct professors uh, and perhaps diluting some of the expertise at our higher education universities. Um, we interviewed a guy, a Republican strategist, Rick Wilson. Um, you've seen you've seen his face on CNN and MSNBC and all that kind of stuff. And he wrote a book called "Everything Trump Touches Dies."
Yeah, I've seen him interviewed. Yeah.
Yeah, and he talked in our interview. He talked about he and his colleagues, the Roger Ailes and what have you,
Mm-hmm.
intentionally dumbing down the electorate, um, stupefying the electorate. And he said he kept talking about the Frankenstein monster, but the monster wasn't Frankenstein. It was the stupid electorate that they created. And now they're having this moment of patriotism and like mea culpa, we really fucked this up. We're in trouble now. And so
Yeah.
from
The
television,
monster.
yeah,
The
yeah,
monster has escaped.
yes. So, all right, you've studied, you've seen um, civilization, societies collapse, transition. Any lessons for us today?
Yeah. So we talk about different ancient civilizations or large complex societies, and we say, how are they really dependent on certain key things? And I
Mhm.
think the thing that we are most dependent on is fossil fuels, period. I mean, every single thing that we do today practically is undergirded by the abundance and availability of fossil fuels. And we could not live like we're living today without them, obviously. You can't electrify everything with solar panels. It's just not feasible right now. Maybe they'll be able to get that going soon enough, but I don't think so. So our complete dependence on fossil fuels and our hubris in thinking that we're going to come up with something before the collapse happens, right? And this is calls to mind something from a guy named James C. Scott. He's an anthropologist, and he puts out these books every few years, and they always have these just like really strong ideas in them. And one of them is called high modernism. And high modernism is basically the robust belief that technology will save us. And it's not, it's a belief, right? It's not based in fact, it's based in what you feel.
Hmm.
And sometimes we might say, oh, those silly Egyptians, they believed that when they sacrificed and when they honored these gods of the Nile, that it would give them a flood. Oh, how silly they were to put all their faith in a god.
Hmm.
Well, we do the same thing. I talk to a lot of my family members who, say, "Oh, we'll figure out the scientists will figure out some sort of technology to circumvent global warming."
Hmm.
Well, until they've done that, I'm not putting my faith in it because I don't do that. Until I can see that it's actually functioning and the numbers are there, I'm not going to put, my safety in that, my life, my children's life in that. You want to be sure that it works on empirical grounds, not on faith-based ground. And I think a lot of us suffer from this high modernism. We believe that the scientists will innovate their way out of this, clean coal, for example, or whatever. Um, it, until that happens, I'm not trusting it, right? I'm empirical based rather than faith based.
Especially when you have a government in place that is firing scientists as fast as they possibly can. Uh,
Right.
how, they're not going to save us by being at the Walmart in Kansas City. Uh,
Right.
did you hear about that? Like 2000 at the Department of Agriculture?
Oh yeah, yeah, and if I say anything that's related to politics, it's me speaking as myself. I just gotta make the caveat because my
Mm.
organization's a 501(c)(3, so we're politically neutral. But me myself, I certainly have political views, and I'm happy to share them. I just want to make sure that I'm speaking for myself, not for my organization.
Well, this is not about your 501c. This is about your
Good.
great book.
I just like to put it out there because the IRS could come after our tens of dollars. So
Hide them in the mattress.
yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, and
if,
so
if we're dumbing down our society, if we're disrespecting um,
oh, absolutely.
scientists and all that, and we're firing them,
It's frustrating to me when people say I don't want my rulers to be like educated elites. I know that's like it's supposed to be a slam against, liberal elites or whatever because they're highly there's there's the education component of there. Oh, you went to college and became indoctrinated, now you're a liberal, whatever. Like I want my elected officials to be smart people.
Mhm.
I don't necessarily want to have a beer with them. A lot of people said, "Oh, but you could have a beer with George W. Bush." Yeah, I wouldn't mind having a beer with George W. Bush. Well, I guess he wouldn't have a beer, but just to like chat with him as a person. As a person, he might be perfectly fine, but as somebody who's in charge of one of the most important countries and economies and militaries in the world, no, I want somebody who I feel is smarter than me, and that uh, yeah, I worry about that. And I'm not saying I'm super smart. I'm just saying I want someone smarter than an average person
Mhm.
in that job. I don't care how personable you are. For example, I think Hillary Clinton would have been better at the job than she was at campaigning for it.
Mhm.
Um, but
Mhm.
uh, yeah.
Now, what about the? I'm 63 years old,
Hmm.
and I'm not long for this world.
Hmm.
And there's going to be, for a long time to come, a huge segment of the population that
Yep.
wants an idiot in the White House, that wants someone that has fallen off the beer truck.
Yeah.
Um, so, is there any hope for me?
uh, I guess I could be glib and a little macabre and say, oh, yeah, there's hope. You said you're not long for the world, so it won't be your problem. Um, no, yeah, of course. There's always hope. I, I don't have any specifics of things to point to other than, there are, I don't really. It's just,
Jesus,
it is a
guys,
disheartening time.
time home. We sought you out to interview for answers.
Well, so, I mean, I can only talk about what I'm doing, and what I'm doing is basically trying to come up with solutions so that if fossil fuel, the tap was turned off tomorrow, I'm not saying I'm a prepper necessarily, but I think about what's going to come after fossil fuel. So,
Mhm.
Kurt Vonnegut had this proposal that governments should have a secretary of the future. And
Ah,
so they think about, what's this going to look like? What's this decision going to look like in 100 years? And I'm not talking every decision, like,
Mm.
many decisions don't really matter on that long of a time scale, but like we want to talk about doing a big infrastructure project. Okay, let's not just think about retrofitting and making our existing infrastructure work for today.
Hmm.
Let's think about what is our transportation network going to be like in 100 years, and how can we make today's infrastructure project so it's easily retrofittable later. Maybe we'll replace individual cars with solar powered light rail systems. Could we make our road beds so that they could be converted into rail beds later on? Like those sorts of things. And I think that would be a wonderful thing to implement. I live in Wisconsin, and when the new governor was elected, I actually applied for a job as the secretary of the future. I didn't get it, uh, but I wanted to put that idea out there more because I think it is a great idea to think much more long term. Where I think we're really stuck. If we can get out of this short term thinking about the next quarter or the next year, but think about the next decade or much farther down the road, we might be making a little better decisions.
It sounds interesting, but I don't see that in anybody's mindset nowadays. Maybe you in rural Wisconsin, but
No, nobody else thinks like that around here. I mean, some people do. I mean, when you start, so I've been running this organization for over 2 years, and the more information I put out there, the more contact I get back from people who
mhm.
are thinking this way. And there is a community out there, and they are thinking long term. But the problem is, nobody in that community is saying that in 100 years we're going to be living like this, but better. They're
Mhm.
saying, in 100 years we're going to be living much different. Maybe there will be a lot of remnants or a lot of vestigial things from this time period that persist socially and technologically and also, physically, but it's going to be a different world. It's going to have to be. Like we just don't have the fossil fuels. And on top of losing, so we talk about integrated systems, right? Or the multiple things happening at once. As we lose fossil fuels, climate change effects are going to become more prevalent. And so as we lose this prolific fuel source that allows us to do so much, we're going to be dealing with a less predictable environment, which is not a great thing. And then if you want to go down your path of poor governance continuing, and that continues, that's yet another straw on that camel's back. So we're really starting to load up the camel's back with straw. And like I said, I can only do what I do here, and a lot of what we do is all hands-on DIY, individual or household or community scale solutions, because things like a Green New Deal are great or would be great, but when you do large scale things like that, the individual who contributes to it doesn't necessarily feel that impact as palpably as, like, if my neighborhood here decided to make a biodigester and we made our own natural gas for use in our stoves. And we, took a couple weekends and we built that together and then we ran it together and then we got free natural gas. That would be something that you would feel a palpable return on your investment. So we try and focus on those sorts of things, not to mention the fact that small scale distributed grids are safer for large scale systemic threats rather
Wow.
than being dependent, like, we're dependent on coal plants and nuclear plants and natural gas plants for power where we live right now, and that one line goes down and we're dark.
Yeah.
So
That's
if you
and becoming more and more likely from an outside threat.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, that's true. Yeah,
mm.
absolutely. Our power system is antiquated and full of holes, unfortunately.
Why can't we have an infrastructure program? Why can't we have an Eisenhower highway
Yeah,
moment?
or a Civilian Conservation Corps again, or Tennessee Valley Authority, or yeah. And that's kind of what I call for in the last chapter, the last really few paragraphs of the Why Did Ancient Civilizations Fail book. Uh, is really a World War II Depression era level of overhaul, and it's actually very similar to what they were saying in the New Deal proposal, not necessarily the specifics, but in their proposal they're saying we need that scale of a change, and I agree. I think we do, and also a change of mindset of people. I think that's in my new book. I call it the Walmart set as kind of a really shorthand way to say people who live today very comfortably in our
Mhm.
economy, and they make, again, economically rational decisions to buy the cheapest stuff, that's close to them, that's easy for them, and they're basically, maximizing their dollar and whatever, their time. But that's at a great cost, right? Anything that's really cheap in the store is cheap for a reason, and usually it's not one that benefits the world or society at large, other than your pocketbook. So, but okay, so where I'm going with this is, how do you get those people to think about critically what they're doing and how they're living, and make them voluntarily adopt a new lifestyle? Because you can't force people to change. They'll either be they'll be forced to change by external factors that are not controlled by people, like a major collapse, and then
Mhm.
they just have to make do, or you have to convince them that it's a good idea ahead of time. And I can't do it. I haven't seen anyone who can effectively really convince a person who is very beholden and very invested in this particular way of life to voluntarily give it up. It's too comfortable. We're just too comfortable.
Mm. On that note,
Um,
Scott.
I'm sorry. But I'm not a pessimist. Really, I'm not. I'm not a pessimist. I think.
That's usually my job.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, no, but I mean, I did get depressed after writing the collapse book, the
Mhm.
Why Civilizations Fail book. I got pretty depressed about it. And it has been kind of the antidote with starting this nonprofit where I work on these
Mhm.
solutions to these problems. So it's like, all right, well, what am I going to do about it? I guess I'll start to come up with these, because I've always been kind of a tinkerer, inventor, researcher type person. So it's been a good change, and I feel like every day I'm doing something, even if it's just demonstrating on our own property how we would transition to a world without fossil fuels. That that's what we're all about.
And what's the name of this book again?
The new one.
No, no,
Oh,
we're pushing, plugging right here.
oh, the Why Did Ancient Civilizations Fail?
All right.